Good evening. Welcome to Recovery and Grace. We're covering the 12 steps of AA as presented in the Big Book, their own document, seeking an understanding of how it is that we all can recover in grace. Now, I say we all, including everyone, not just drug addicts and alcoholics, because I know whenever you use the term recovery, the first thing that pops into our mind are 12-step meetings or recovery centers of one sort or another. They're filled with people struggling with substance use disorders. And, that's not an unfair idea, but it's not complete. It's not complete in the sense that all human beings are in need of recovery. And that's been a common theme throughout our study as we've gone through the first 8 steps of the 12 steps of AA, seeking to build an understanding of how all of us as human beings need recovery. So let me give you a quick definition, my definition of what recovery is. Recovery is really the ability of an individual, a human being, to actually love another person, just like Jesus. That's what recovery is about. It's not simply abstinence from whatever addiction we were wrapped up in or life controlling issue. It is a proactive lifestyle of love. It's an exciting lifestyle. It's one that I hope you'll get a little more of an insight to tonight as we look at the 9th step, and particularly the promises given to us in the Big Book concerning those who do steps 8 and 9, who have worked the program all the way through. So in terms of recovery, I want us to understand and have this basic baseline in our thinking that this is a process all human beings are involved in, and we can learn much from that. The title Recovery and Grace emphasizes also the fact that our recovery is by grace, by the grace of God. Now, by that term, I'm not talking about God's mercy. His mercy is important. His mercy is wonderful. His mercies are renewed daily. You see, mercy is when you screw up, you blow it, and God withholds his punishment from you. He doesn't just squash you like a bug and fry you in hell because you messed up. He gives you mercy. That's mercy. All of us need mercy, and that's good. But that is not the grace of God. The grace of God is something far more than just mercy. The grace of God is a supernatural way in which God works in you through his Spirit, having created a new person in you, works in you the very life of his son Jesus to be able to fulfill his calling to love others just like he did. You see, Jesus came to show us the love of God. He came to show us what the Father really looked like, what he was concerned with. And he's given us that mission as well. As we have turned the relational corner, as we studied last week, having developed our relationship, our vertical relationship between us and God, we are now turning that relational corner and addressing the horizontal relationship between us and everybody around us. You see that those two dimensions of our relationship is what Christianity is all about. It's a vertical relationship between you and God and a horizontal relationship between you and others. In terms of recovery and grace, then, what we're talking about is the supernatural way that God enables you to actually love other people just like his son Jesus. And it's an amazing thing. It's an amazing lifestyle. It's a truly exciting lifestyle. The spirit of boredom will definitely flee from you when you enter into this lifestyle. And I encourage you to take note on what it is that we're going to have to do to enter into a lifestyle of grace. Now, as we've studied already back in step 8, we simply made a list of people we'd hurt, a list of people we'd offended, a list of people that we had somehow harmed in our previous life up to this point, and became willing to make amends with those people. We became willing to actually develop a healthy relationship with those people. That's doing our part. But now in step 9, we're actually getting down to the nitty-gritty. As the step says, we made direct amends to such people wherever possible, except when to do so would injure them or others. Now, that's a mouthful, and we want to take time tonight to discuss that fully so you have an understanding. I think probably the best way I can begin to describe this for you is that the 9th step, in my estimation at least, is one of the most dangerous steps we can take in terms of our recovery. You see, the 9th step is kind of like where the rubber meets the road. You know, it's kind of like the actual demonstration of your recovery, is when you're taking this 9th step and trying to make direct amends. And because of that, it's filled with all kinds of pitfalls. I like what the big book has to say about this and its lengthy discussion of making direct amends, because it warns us there. It warns us that there is a possibility that if we try to make amends with someone, if we try to heal up a relationship, we could actually cause them more injury, or we could cause harm to others as well. I think the best biblical illustration I have of that is found in Matthew 18. In Matthew 18, Jesus discusses his instructions concerning offenses and the destruction of people offending one another. Now, he's a realist, so in that passage, he says, "Woe unto the world because of offenses, for it must needs be that offenses come." You see, he's a realist. He knows if we live together, if we interact with each other, sooner or later, we're going to irritate one another and offend one another. So he's not backing away from this at all. But at that point, he gives us some really strange instruction here. He says, "The world will be filled with offenses, but woe unto that man by whom the offense comes." Now, in this case, I was trying to make amends. That's us. We're the ones that hurt other people. We're the ones that harmed other people. And so you might begin thinking immediately, oh, no, I'm in trouble now. God's going to get me. Well, that's not what Jesus was talking about when he said, "Woe to that man by whom the offense comes." He was talking about the fact that that man was in trouble. Now, if you review your life and you made a list of people you've hurt, you know you did so because you were in trouble, because you were caught up in an addiction, or you were caught up in some other life-controlling issue that caused you to offend other people. Now, taking ownership of that and responsibility of that, we don't pawn it off on other people. We own it, but we need to go a step further here in figuring out why it is that Jesus said, "Woe to that man by whom the offense comes." You see, in that context, he used some very graphic language, and one of the things he says in that context is that it would be better for that man that a millstone were tied about his neck and he were drowned and cast in the sea. What in the world he's talking about? He's talking about the fact that it is painful when you're in a position to hurt other people. It is a slow death. It is a painful death. And the reason for that is the root of our offenses. The writer of Hebrews calls it the root of bitterness. And we might just simply refer to it simply as hate. You see, hatred festering within our souls is what causes us to hurt other people. We get offended, we get hurt, and from that, we get hate. We start to seek revenge. We start to fight back. We start to think and plan ways that we can hurt other people. That hatred festering within us is causing us a slow death. physically as well as relationally and personally. And so Jesus goes on to say we need to deal with that. In order to deal with and make amends with others, we need to deal first with our own hatred. And unfortunately, those people who try to make direct amends without dealing with their own resentments and bitternesses and hatred have a difficult time and usually wind up hurting other people, continuing the offense, or harming others. And so, how do we deal with that? Well, Jesus used some very graphic language. And I'm kind of hesitant to use this language here because invariably somebody, when they read this, actually go out and try to do it physically. He says, if your hand offend thee, cut it off. If your eye offended, pluck it out. If you are offending someone else, he's talking about doing radical surgery. Now, he's not talking about physically poking out your eye. He's not talking about physically cutting off your hand, but he is using that as a metaphor for what it feels like to deal with our own hatred. This is why people don't do it. This is why we stuff it down inside, pretend it's not there. We don't like to deal with our hatred because it hurts. Not only are we remembering the offense that originally happened to us and the hurt, but then we also feel the guilt and remorse for that hurt that we've caused other people, caught up in the what I refer to as a hurt, hate, hurt cycle. And so it's a difficult thing to deal with that hatred, but it's absolutely essential. Now, in the recovery process that we've been talking about, we mentioned that and talked about it in some detail when we were talking and discussing the earlier steps, particularly step 4, which we made a searching, fearless moral inventory. And we identified our resentments, our hatred. And also step 5, when we confessed it to another human being and had God get rid of it in step 6 and 7. And so theoretically, we've all done what Jesus was talking about in the first 14 verses of Matthew chapter 18, where he says, you need to deal with your hatred. But then he gives the instruction that is more applicable to what we're talking about here today or tonight in terms of the 9th step. He says, if your brother offend you, go and tell him his fault between you and him alone. If you can't resolve it, bring with you a couple of witnesses, seek counseling, another way of saying that. And if you still can't resolve it, reveal it to the church. Now, I'm not going to go into all the details of all the ramifications of what that means to us today, but rather to point out this essential, necessary ingredient for the 9th step, and that is to have dealt with the issues of hatred in our own life, and then to go to whoever it is we've offended with the sole purpose of loving them, the sole purpose of reconciling, the sole purpose of admitting that we were wrong. And the reason I say sole purpose, and we touched on this in our last study, was that often we can go seek to make direct amends for the wrong reason. That is, because we want to be relieved of a debt or a guilt that we've experienced or whatever. Now, the right reason to go is because you are led by the Spirit of God to go to them for the sake of them, not for your sake, but for their sake. Now, this is an act of love. This is a nitty-gritty act of love in which you make direct amends with those you've hurt for their sake in loving them. But it also makes you vulnerable. It opens you up to all kinds of attacks. It opens you up to rejection once again. And in that respect, it's a dangerous step. However, as the big book points out, step 9, 8, and 9 both are essential steps for recovery. And the reason I want to talk about that just for a moment, the reason they call it essential, they go on to explain in their narrative in the big book, but the reason I want you to add to that is the fact that when you turn that relational corner, then you are called to love others like Christ. You are called to the ministry of loving others. And that's what steps 8 and 9 are all about. In the previous steps, you're being prepared to love others. But in steps 8 and 9, you are actually loving other people like Christ. To make direct amends where possible is to love other people like Christ. And the one caveat I want to present in this to you is it has to be under the direct supervision and leadership, personal leadership of the Spirit of God Himself. You see, only God knows the response of that other person. Only God knows the timing. Only God knows what that other person needs. And so this is something that must be done not in concert with your own understanding, but in concert with the understanding of God. Now, right along with that, as our panel is going to talk about tonight, there's also highly recommended that you include your sponsor or another responsible human being that has been through this recovery process with you, that has actually walked along beside of you, led you in it, encouraged you in it, so that you're not floundering around on your own, just trying to hear God on your own and know what to do here. So even though there's a lot of obstacles, a lot of pitfalls in your effort to love others, I want to leave you with this guarantee that Jesus gave His disciples. I don't think that His disciples, on the night before He was crucified, when He met with them in the upper room, I don't think they were any more prepared to do step 9 than we are. I don't think they were any more prepared to fulfill their ministry of loving than we are. But Jesus assured them by giving them this guaranteed promise. And this guaranteed promise for a prayer request is simply this: Lord, show me who you want me to love. Tell me how to do it. That is a guaranteed prayer request in which the Spirit of God will go before you and leading you and come after you and cleaning up your mess when you're trying to love other people like Christ. And in step 9, it's absolutely essential that we have that leadership of the Spirit praying that prayer to be used of God for the sake of others to love. Now, it's in the loving itself that we have achieved recovery. It's in being able to supernaturally care about other people, to care about the hurt that we've caused them, to care about their lives. It's in that caring and that loving that we achieve recovery, real recovery. So I'm going to stop at this point right now and bring our panel in. We have a lot to discuss here this evening, and I'm hoping that you'll gain. David Currington back with us again in recovery. And David, I think I'll start with you tonight on the 9th step. I'll go ahead and start with you and sharing your own experience with the 9th step and reacting and responding to the things I've shared about it so far.
Okay. Well, thank you, John. A lot of what you said there was very right on. I mean, in every one of the steps, there's a prayer associated, and there's also one with this. I'd like to kind of start with that. This is one of the prayers on the 9th step, but it says, God, I pray for the right attitude to make my amends, being ever mindful not to harm others in the process. I ask for your guidance. Now, I'll start by telling you that my attempts in the beginning in recovery was to, kind of do 1, 2, and 3, and then jump over to a 9, trying to make amends, tell people, in other words, trying to get ahead of working the steps. And that was not very fruitful. Number one, I had several relapses, so that kind of put that in the dust. So my experience with working through the first 8 steps and then doing a 9th step was very enlightening for me. when I did it under the guidance of a sponsor, because being young and immature in the process of recovery, my motives were wrong, as John had indicated. I was doing it to clean up, get rid of guilt and shame and things, and it wasn't for the purpose of loving others. When I actually made some amends to people and for that purpose, for loving them and caring about their well-being, it was a big change in me. I was very surprised at the results that I had from certain amends and what the people said back to me. So my experience also, there's a one element for me that comes to mind, and that's making amends to myself. Because being an addict and an alcoholic and an addict, I trampled on my own soul and my own spirit, my own heart, did things that harmed me emotionally, spiritually, physically, relationally, myself. And there was a lot of grief, a lot of pain associated with what I did to my own self. So they're making amends, in the Alpha series, and learning who I am and who God's made me to be, putting death that old person, but still having the flesh, which with all the memories and all of the attributes and the the power behind those character defects. And as he started putting them to death, and our 6th and 7th step and stuff, then it kind of it started to help me to forgive myself, and that was very strong in my personal recovery, was forgiving myself for the things I did, because I was my own worst critic on what I did to harm other people, because it was all motivated out of selfish and self-centeredness. I wanted what I wanted. And turning the corner and learning how to love other people and thinking of their needs and what I did to them has been a process of me seeing that. God reveals things to me in his time as what I actually did to other people. One of the blinding parts of addiction is the fact that you just don't really think you're hurting other people. That's just part of the blindedness. When you're in denial, you don't really think you're hurting other people. But as you start coming out of that, you realize how you've hurt other people in multiple ways. Just by your selfish and self-centeredness, not being responsible, not in all aspects of life, work, family, and everything else. So my experience with the step, again, like I said, was forgiving myself was a major part. And then looking at what I've done to other people and stuff is still for me. I haven't finished my 9th step. I haven't completely finished it. And I don't know, how much longer that's going to take, and I don't know if it'll ever end. But I think the key factor is the willingness, to be willing to make amends to people. And then God puts the people in my life, and I've had that happen even recently, put somebody in my life that I wouldn't expect I'd run into, and I was able to make an amends to that person just recently. So that's my 2 cents. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, David. Those 2 senses made sense. All right. And the thing that I take away the most from that is the fact that it's an ongoing process, and as your experience illustrates, but it's a process that involves not only receiving the love of God for yourself and forgiving yourself, but also extending it to others. And that's really what the 9th step is about, is that first step of loving others, seeking to make direct amends. Pam, let's switch over to you and have you comment from your experience. And I'm sure you've got a quote from Breathing Underwater, right?
You think? Thank you, John. You were talking earlier about the, I think you equated the working the steps as to surgery of some sort. And I found that interesting because one of the original founders of what turned into the 12-step program was a man by the name of Frank Buckman. And he actually described the process that became the 12 steps. He was with the Oxford group, and he described it as soul surgery. That's what he called this process. And I think that is absolutely one of the very best descriptions I've ever heard. It's not, it's not designed to be fun. It's nothing that you just wake up one day and say, oh, golly gee, I think I want to be a better person. I think I'm going to go, through this process. It's something that is usually motivated by severe problems and pain. That's the only reason that you sign up to have a surgery. In talking about the directness of the amends, one of the things that Richard Rohr did say in Breathing Underwater was that his definition of direct was that they had to be specific, personal, concrete, and insofar as possible, face to face. And I thought that was a pretty strong description of what it would mean to do something direct. I could find an argument for making step 9 two classes to even begin to do it justice, with the first one being on making direct amends and the second one on the wisdom of except when it would injure them or others. But all we've got here is one evening, and I was reading through the big book on step 9, and several things came to my mind about it. One of the things that is so powerful about having a book, whether it's the Bible and or a 12-step book of some sort, is that as you read it over time, your experience and what the Holy Spirit brings to your awareness changes. And I'm having that experience as we're doing that, and the steps this way. One of the things that came to my mind was a statement in the big book that resentment blocks us from the sunlight of the Spirit. And as I read, that is what I call 12-step-ish for not being able to experience the love of God. That in the 9th step promise that David read, that is one of the promises, and there's actually 18 promises in the promises that, I'm sorry, he didn't read the promises, he read the prayer. Okay, yeah. We need to read the promises. But there's 18 promises that the big book gives after completion of the 9th step. And one of them is that direct experience of feeling the nearness of God. What we're doing in the 9th step is resolving our resentments. You talked a lot about love, and my favorite book on this subject is actually a different book, and not one for everybody. It's not a Christian book, but it's called The Spirituality of Imperfection. And in The Spirituality of Imperfection, they actually cite sort of a research study that was done by a group in Seattle on the subject of forgiveness, the experience of forgiveness. And it triggered in my mind the quote that I used last week by Henry Nouwen, that forgiveness is love practiced among people who love poorly. I found the book. It was called The Wounded Healer by Henry Nouwen. And so if we're talking about this being about loving other people, and forgiveness is love practiced among people who love poorly, then the experience that these researchers found on the power of forgiveness is actually a experience of love. And it's several pages in the Spirituality of Imperfection. I'm not going to go into the whole thing, but what they found in their research was that the experience of being able to forgive was preceded by some experience of being forgiven. Now, as Christians, we recognize that, first of all, is always being the experience of being forgiven by God and having that forgiveness planted in our hearts. But then they go on to talk about the power of the ninth step. It says the first discovery is that we have been forgiven, which somehow makes possible the second discovery, and that is that we have forgiven. When David was talking about forgiving himself, my experience with doing that, I think I said in something else that we were reading, I was the sorriest person you would ever want to meet. I mean, my favorite, I'm sorry. You know, to the point that my sponsor said, Pam, everybody already knows how sorry you are. Now they want to know what you're going to do about it. And this whole process of forgiving myself is part of the power of the ninth step. They said the power of AA's ninth step is that it permits the possibility, not promise, the possibility of experiencing forgiveness. The experience first of being forgiven that then makes it possible for us to forgive and thus become free of the number one offender, that being resentment. As I went through my process of the ninth step, making my amends, seeing over time, sometimes not immediate, but over time, people forgiving me, I was able to forgive the other people in my life and to forgive myself. I tell people it's one of my favorite things to say, and no one can shame me today because I have been through the process of seeing God take what was meant for evil and use it for good. And that does not happen overnight. It takes time to have that experience. Making the direct amends and doing it in, as you mentioned earlier, wisdom. This is why it is so important that we do the entire 12-step process with another person. Yes, under the direct leadership of the Holy Spirit. However, as we say in the program, denial is not a river in Egypt. We are given to lie to ourselves. And having that person that we have been through the 8 preceding steps with to build trust, so that when they speak into our lives and say, you know, right now, I don't think that's a real good idea. I think what you're thinking about might end up injuring others. The Big Book does some very, very specific directions for doing this and then leaves up a lot of things that it is doubtful issues. Thank you. But the prayer, as I went back and read it in the book this evening, I was struck with it. It talks about on page 79 some general principles but it says reminding ourselves that we have decided to go to any length. Now, I use that phrase regularly in saying any length to stay sober, any length to whatever. I was reading this evening. That's not what the big book says. The big book says we have decided to go to any length to find a spiritual experience. Find a spiritual experience. We ask, this is their prayer. We ask that we be given the strength and direction to do the right thing, no matter what the personal consequences may be. Strength and direction to do the right thing, no matter what the personal consequences may be. That's my experience with the ninth step. And if anyone is looking for, so many times when I was working at the jail, the women would say, I just can't feel God. I just don't feel God, And over and over again, I would say, the big book says, before we are halfway through, which is a promise after the fifth step. But that actual experience isn't really until the promise is in the ninth step. That will actually be a strong experience. And anytime I'm not having that experience, it's probably because I'm harboring a resentment. Thanks.
Yeah, and you mentioned, Pam, the promises here of the ninth step. And Bill, before I get to you, let me just read these promises
18 of them.
out of the big book. It says, if we are painstaking about this phase of our development, now what it's talking about is, doing the first 8, 9 steps. If we're painstaking about this phase of our development, we will be amazed before we are halfway through. We are going to know a new freedom and a new happiness. We will not regret the past, nor wish to shut the door on it. We will comprehend the word serenity, and we will know peace. No matter how far down the scale we have gone, we will see how our experience can benefit others. That feeling of uselessness and self-pity will disappear. We will lose interest in selfish things and gain interest in our fellows. Self-seeking will slip away. Our whole attitude and outlook upon life will change. Fear of people and of economic insecurities will leave us. We will realize that God is doing for us what we could not do for ourselves. Now, they go on to assure the reader that, these are not extravagant promises, but they will materialize sooner or later in all who turn that relational corner and follow through. The thing I wanted to emphasize there is the fact that this is the kind of experience, the spiritual experience Pam was talking about. You'll give up anything for that kind of experience. But the thing I want to connect it with is it comes in turning the corner to care about other people. And the reason for that is that's what we were created for. That's the real person we are. And we become fully aware of that as we make those direct amends according to the leadership of the Spirit and the wisdom of people who are counseling with us and working with us. So that's my comment on it. Just want to make sure you all got those promises in there. Bill, let's go to you.
All right. I think one of the things that I heard consistently with what everybody talking was that this is a process. And before we went live, Pam said that John was talking about that this is a dangerous step. And Pam says that's why it's step 9, not step 2. I know that in my own life, I would read books, on spiritual growth and spirituality. And just reading the books, I thought I had arrived. Well, I agree with this, therefore I've arrived. I'm there. And a lot of it was, to love other people, not to be selfish. So I knew I wasn't supposed to be selfish anymore. You should be more giving, more loving, more patient, don't hate. And because I read those things and said, well, now that I'm a Christian, I'm supposed to do those things, I got discouraged very fast when I still continued to be self-centered and I still continued to be selfish. And what happened was, when the 12 steps came along and God put them in my life, and I really believe when the student is ready, the teacher will appear. When that model came into my life, step 4 and 5 were crucial in dealing with those resentments. And some of the people that I had to make amends with were on my resentment list. So that got a little, and my sponsor, he guided me through it. He says, listen, he says, we know that some of these people owe you an apology, but you're only taking care of your side. If they don't reciprocate, don't get upset, don't get mad. And, and it didn't. And I know there's we always deal with fear of failure and fear of rejection. So this step, especially when you've run an addiction and you've stolen money from family members and you've done all those things, you're going to make amends. There's a serious risk of those people saying, listen, I've heard it all before, or I don't want to talk to you. Or sometimes when you seek forgiveness, the person will forgive you, but they need to talk about it first. And it sounds like they're not forgiving you because they're telling you how you've hurt them. And I think you need to be prepared to listen to that, because sometimes it's them getting it out on their end. Like Richard Rohr says, that you're opening the door from your side. And we've all mentioned it, that this isn't, I got to get this guilt, this monkey off my back, so I'm going to tell you whatever. It's not true confession time or get that person to forgive you so you feel better. It's healing, and God always looks at the big picture and loves everybody involved. He loves everyone involved in this whole process. So it's going to be healing on both ends. And we didn't really talk too much about it tonight, where it says, unless doing so would cause harm to others. But there are situations where it would cause harm to others. And I know that in my life, there's been times when I've held resentments against people. They really didn't know about it. So dealing and getting rid of those, but I know that it affected our communication, where I would avoid them or not talk to them much, but they didn't know. So for me to go and say, hey, I was hating you, that might not be the way to make the amends. But once I dealt with my own resentments, the issue's gone. There really is no issue. So therefore, communication could increase, and you treat the person differently, and you're making amends that way, because you don't know. We all said it too. Everybody said it. Led by the Spirit, God's got to lead you. With many advisors, our plans succeed, and to get that guidance, and to see it as a time of healing. That God wants to heal, and if He leads you to do it, and the response is negative, the door is open. The door is open from your side. So it's a process. I think what changes first for all of us is our desires. That doesn't necessarily mean that our conditioning is going to change, because the transformation's up to God. He's changing us from the inside out. So I saw a lot of my desires change, but not my actions. I remember one night we were just it was after dinner. I was doing the dishes, and I was just kind of meditating as I did the dishes. My daughter Sarah was sitting in the front room, right in front of the kitchen, and I just blurted it out because I was thinking about things and looking at my life, and I blurted out, "Man, I am a control freak." And Sarah, man, she popped up and looked around and she said, "Hallelujah, this is great, hallelujah." And I said, "Sarah," and I knew it instinctively. I said, "Sarah, just because I know you think that now, I'm going to stop being such a control freak with you because I recognize it." I said, "I don't know if it's going to change anytime soon." But
And
she
Grace
was
is still
she
waiting.
was really happy. Yeah, and Carrie said Grace is still waiting for it to change. So the last one, the last girl standing in our home.
It's so scary.
So that's the thing. I think the key thing that I heard tonight, that this is a process, and as you follow the leadership of the Spirit. But I know in my own experience, the promises of step 9, I experienced a lot of that with just going through step 4 and 5. I mean, the freedom that I felt just dealing with those resentments, because I was the nice guy act, like, oh, everything's fine. Meanwhile, I was churning on the inside and hating on the inside. But there is this freedom that you have, and especially if reconciliation comes. If you've loved that person, and there's nothing better than that. John, you mentioned that you're not going to be bored with this lifestyle, and when you're loving other people, that's to know that God is expressing His love for you. There's nothing more dynamic or exciting than that. So it's and I hope that the folks that are practicing, they have a sponsor or someone, an elder, someone that's wise, that's going to lead them through it.
Yeah, and I think, Bill, what you're saying is absolutely correct. And I want to emphasize the fact that the experience of our own recovery and being able to experience the fullness of that comes about when we turn that corner and we are willing to make direct amends. Now, how the Lord leads you in that and what actually happens, etc., that's all up grabs here. But the point I'm making is that you experience the love of God when you express the love of God. And so a lot of what you experienced in steps 4 and 5, the love of God, is actually intensified when you do steps 8 and 9. It's again, just another little connection here of how the steps all work together. We're taking them one at a time. 1 week we're on step 8, and the next night we're on step 9. Next week we'll be on step 10. But they actually are dovetailing with each other continuously every day. And we'll be talking more about that as we enter into steps 10, 11, and 12, because they don't go away. These are not steps to be taken and said, and you say in your mind, oh, well, I did step 9, so I made direct amends, so, I can move on. I'll never have to do that again. I think David in his testimony points out to us, no, it's a continual thing, and it's not something you just one day or one time. It's something you're always looking for. And it's that way with all the steps. The thing that impresses me most about these, we call them steps, but I prefer to think of them as principles, life principles that we live by, all of which are vital and important. And here, when you turn the corner and you seek the welfare of another by attempting to make direct amends with them for the harm that you've caused, I think that principle is one of the most life-giving principles in all the 12 principles. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Bill and let him wrap it up. Unless Pam or David have something more.
Yeah, thanks. I really do. One of the things that Bill was talking about, as far as the changing the way you relate to the person over time, and that is what I have been taught to call a living amends. And that is that the way I live and relate to that person changes. And that was extremely important for me. It sounds terrible to say, and I don't mean to make light of anything, but because of the situation that I was in, I really did not have a lot of stealing and other kinds of behaviors like that. I was almost envious of people that their amends were that kind of concrete stuff that they could go into a store and say, look, I stole from you and blah 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 blah, and I want to pay you X amount, or I just concrete things that you could know when what you did and when you were done. And I didn't have much of that. The most of the amends that I had to make were what we call living amends. And that was that I changed the way I related to the people. One of the greatest joys of my recovery, I'll start crying, this is serious, is that my mother, I lived long enough after I got sober. She sent me a little card. It's in my box, the box where you keep your little stuff. Well, it's in my box. She sent me a card, and in that card, it was like a little pop-up Hallmark card that when you opened it up, all the butterflies came out. If you'll notice, I've got a butterfly ring on. I wear it all the time. And in that card, my mother said, I am so grateful that I lived long enough to see you become the person I always knew you could be. That's a living amends. That's a living amends. Also, John, I don't want to short shuffle the final paragraph in the promises, because it's the final promise. And in that final paragraph, you touched on it. You said, are these extravagant promises? We think not. They are being fulfilled among us, sometimes quickly, sometimes slowly. They will, and this is the word I want highlighted, always. Always. That's the final promise in the promises. They will always materialize if we work for them. Thanks.
Yep, I appreciate that, Pam, because that is so true. I like the idea of living amends. That kind of correlates with a living sacrifice. We're called to be changing your lifestyle to actually. I like to use the phrase being transformed from a selfish and self-centered taker to a compassionate and loving giver. And that becoming a compassionate and loving giver, I think making direct amends is just like the first step of that. You know what I'm saying? It's like a declaration that, hey, change is coming. But as you live your life, David, I've seen that in your life because I know you personally. I've seen that living amends being worked out continuously because you didn't just say, oh, well, I'm sorry, and let's make amends and make up and forget it. There was a change, a life change that people could see that continued to remind people of the transformation that occurred in your life. And I can't underscore how important this is for people who are in a program of some sort. And I'm not just talking about the AA program in the community, but I'm talking about people in a long-term type of recovery program like Faith Farm or Dunklin, where they're away from home for 10 months or a year or whatever, and they come home expecting to say a quick, I'm sorry, and that's making a no. When they come home, their wife, their kids, their spouse, whoever is around them is going to be expecting to see a radical life change, or it's just another game. It's not real. And, they're sometimes really offended when people don't believe that they've changed, but it's got to be lived out. And so Pam, I think that is really an important concept of living amends. I like that very much.
Yeah, and I think
Okay,
sometimes,
that's my little.
yeah, to the folks that are on the other end, that's really more important than the apology itself. They wanna see, and sometimes whether it's the kid or the spouse, they're going to test you to see if you've changed.
Oh yeah.
Test the waters and push some buttons and see it'll take a while. So that's something where the whole family needs to be. They need help. The whole family needs to be encouraged and ministered to when there's that kind of reentry thing. And we've dealt with that. So just want to say hi to some of the people that have been watching tonight. Marsha's out there. Nancy Young, the Lacasses are listening. I picture them, how like the old time families used to hang out around the radio. I picture the Lacasses all kind of bunched up. Wendy from Palm City. That's John's cousin, right? Colorado. Rhonda Freeman. Sandy. John. Grandma's out there. Kim, she's a friend of recovery. Mandy Tucker. Sandy Pearson mentioned, don't be overcome with evil, but overcome evil with good. I told Rhonda in the notes that we would get some information out there. There's that light blue workout, like it's a 8x11 light blue notebook. That's kind of a workbook on the 12 steps. You know what I'm talking about, Pam? Or
There is a 12 and 12 and that talks about more about the steps, but the steps are not, and I'm not putting the steps are not meant to be done in a book. There's no work book. Okay, that like I can take home, and I'm not saying this is what Rhonda's asking for, but I'm just underlining the point that John and we've all been making all evening. This is something that has to be done with another person. You do not do this alone in a workbook.
Yeah.
Thank you, David.
And it's because it's, they've traveled down the road that you're on. They're further along on it. It's kind of like raising teenagers. We've been down that road, and they think that we haven't or something. So that's good. Sunday service, 11 a.m. at the ranch, Reach Community Church for those that are checking in from there. 9 o'clock at Causeway Cove. That's where our temporary spot for now, where Dave has everybody getting together. Thursday night, Tom Benbow and I will be doing the relational empowerment class, and Pam, whoever else joins the discussion afterwards, we'll be kind of talking about some of the same issues on forgiveness and restoration and reconciliation among family members, breaking through the hate cycle that John was talking about. So that's what we'll be doing in the future. Anybody have any other announcements?
I just wanted to mention I started, and I have been starting my own watch party for these, and there's probably about 20 or 25 people. So I just really want to encourage anybody that is interested to start your own watch party and pass this around.
Yeah. And then next Thursday, a week from this Thursday, I'm going to have on a gentleman by the name of Linwood Bagby. He runs a ministry called Restore Ministry up in New Jersey, and he's been doing that for years. He works with inner city kids, and we're going to talk about, kind of his ministry, because he's kind of been a father to the fatherless. And we're going to talk about that extended family thing with him and some of the issues that he faces. And we're also going to talk about, what's going on in the country as far as race relations as well. Linwood's African American. We're going to do it on the Relational Empowerment Hour, the 23rd.
Okay.
The 23rd, which is a week from this Thursday. coming up, and you know, we can all be on that panel, but he's going to share what he's doing, because I think what he's doing is he's applying the gospel to the whole situation, and he has been single his whole life, but he, like I said, been a father to the fatherless. So, and he's going to talk about, you know, some of his relational empowerment with that. So we have those types of things coming up, and John and I, we had a real interesting meeting today, and so we are always trying to figure out what God is doing and follow his lead, instead of saying, hey, God, come bless my little plan that I have here. So that's what we see going on. All right, I want to say good night to everybody. Thank you for joining. God's grace is sufficient. His power is made perfect in weakness. Nothing in all creation, not even death itself, not even you're part of all creation. Nothing can separate us from the love of God in Christ Jesus. Good night, everybody.
Good night.